What is up? Welcome to the Pure Desire podcast on YouTube. Lives and relationships are being destroyed by unwanted sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. Our goal with this podcast is to have weekly conversations that give encouragement, experience, and expertise on how to take your life back from the effects of unwanted sexual behavior and betrayal. We sit down with Pure Desire staff, addiction and betrayal experts, and other voices in the recovery world to help you take back your life from the effects of unwanted sexual behavior. My name is Trevor Windsor, and I am the host of this podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. All right, here's this week's episode. Preston Sprinkle, welcome to the Pure Desire podcast. Thanks for being with us, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I don't know. I mean, Nick, maybe you can talk to your fandom a little bit, but I think it's safe to say we're both fans of you and your work and the conversations you're having. I know for me, I've listened to your podcast, Theology In The Raw, quite a bit over the last, probably last year. I have some friends who've been on it and people I wish I was friends with on your podcast as well. And so been listening to your stuff, but our listeners will have maybe heard, well, they will for sure hear about you in the intro, but we're grateful that you're just willing to spend time with us talking about what you and your organization are passionate about, which is really the LGBTQ community and the church. So for our listeners that maybe aren't familiar with you or your ministry, your books, your work, anything, will you tell them a little bit about yourself and the kind of ministry that you're in?
Sure, yeah. So I'm president of a nonprofit called the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, and our whole mission is to help resource the church, typically like Christian leaders, on questions about faith, sexuality, and gender. And our kind of twin pillars are theological faithfulness, okay, and then courageous love. So how can we hold true to what the Bible says about faith, sexuality, and gender, and also love people who may fall short of that standard, which really is all of us at the end of the day, but specifically, you know, LGBTQ people have, for the most part, had a really poor experience with Christians in the church. So I'm trying to help change the culture of the church, to make it more more kind, more hospitable, more loving, and yet also maintaining a historic Christian view of sexual ethics. And I don't think those two are at odds. I guess that's my big selling point. The big heart of my mission is I think you can be loving toward all people while maintaining a traditional sexual ethic. So we've been going for almost over 5 years now. Before that, I had written some books on what the Bible says about sexuality. Recently wrote a book on transgender identities. And so I would say I've been in this conversation maybe for about 8 years or so, writing and speaking and so on. So it's been a journey.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, such a needed conversation. And I mean, imagine that, what you described, a church that is loving and kind towards people that aren't like us. And it is kind of sad that we live in a day and age that's not necessarily a given. You know, what we know about the church, we should be loving and kind towards all people. And yet this is an area, I think, especially that we have struggled because there's so many misunderstandings, there's misconception, there's people are quick to jump to judgments or ideas of what it means if someone says, I am this or I'm that. And it just can be difficult. And because of that, it's easy to avoid. And I think a lot of Christians do avoid it until maybe something happens in their world that's very personal, something happens in their family, a friend, someone comes out and says, I've decided I'm, the other gender, or I'm letting you know I'm gay. And all of a sudden, something they've worked very hard to avoid is very personal and front and center. And they end up, grabbing hold of books by Preston Sprinkle and saying, okay, what is it that I need to understand? Because I think many of us did grow up in a type of Christianity that basically made these, like you just said, kind of mutually exclusive, that, well, we either love and embrace or we have a biblical ethic of sexuality, and there's really nowhere in between. So I love the way, Preston, that you're creating a framework for how can we do both well, because I think what you just said is so key. And so tell us a little bit, one of the jokes we make around here is no one aspires to going into a ministry to work with sexual integrity and brokenness and pornography and addiction. Like, that's not a little kid's dream when they're shooting hoops in the driveway. And so I imagine kind of similar for you, like you didn't aspire to say, boy, one day I want I want to wade into the most controversial topics that exist in the Christian world.
Yeah.
So, how did you find yourself moving into this arena?
Yeah.
What did God do in your life to bring you to this place?
Yeah. Well, I sort of did fall into it. I don't have any in my personal story, never wrestled with same-sex attraction, never really had anybody close to me that did. So
Mm.
it really began as almost like an academic journey. Like I love theology. I was teaching at a Bible college for many years, and I love to wrestle with controversial issues. I'm
Yeah.
not a controversial kind of person, but usually if something's controversial in the church, it's usually because there's smart people on both sides, and
Yeah.
there's things we need to kind of think through. And I've always been, even prior to wrestling with sexuality and stuff, I've often been a fan of asking the question, what does the Bible actually say?
Yeah.
If I said, is sex outside of marriage okay or not? Most Christians are going to say, well, no. And if I said, all right, prove it from scripture,
Yeah.
how many could cite a chapter or verse, or
Yeah.
or might say like, oh, well, God says don't commit adultery. I'm like, okay, that's having sex with somebody else's spouse. What about two consensual teenagers who are in love? And I've often been disappointed with kind of what I call thin answers to thick questions. Here's this
Mm.
complex thing I'm wrestling with, and I go to a Christian, and hey, what do you think about this? And they usually give some kind of like just an answer that just seems regurgitated and
Yeah.
flat and not too thoughtful. So anyway, my whole Christian journey has been trying to really understand not just what do I believe, but why do I believe it?
Yeah.
So all that kind of gave me a running start to, in 10 years ago, and somebody suggested I should write a book on what the Bible says about homosexuality. And
Mm.
I said, all right, I thought it'd be a quick and easy book to write. Come to find out, there's a
Just
little
knock
more
us out on a
controversial than
long, knock it out
Yeah.
on a long
yeah, and
weekend.
here I
huh?
am, 10 years later.
Oh my gosh.
So to answer your question, it really did begin out of a theological interest. Like, oh
Yeah.
wow, I've never actually worked through what the Bible says about this. I know
Yeah.
what I'm supposed to say, but I don't really know what the Bible says. And so that took me on a theological journey, but then that quickly led into a relational journey where I started to
Yeah.
get to know lots of gay and lesbian people, many of whom were raised in a church, and pretty much all of whom had a horrible relational experience in the church. Not
Yeah.
just like, oh, the church was loving and kind, but I just couldn't sign off on its traditional sexual ethic. I rarely, if ever, heard that
Wow.
narrative where
Yeah.
it really was simply the theology that
Yeah.
was the hang up.
Yeah.
In almost every story that I've heard of dozens and dozens of LGBT people raised in a church,
Yeah.
there was relational stuff that I'm like, well, we could fix that without changing our theology. So
Yeah.
that kind of ignited my real passion in the journey.
Yeah. I like what you said, the thin answer to the thick question. I think
Yeah.
we wade into that pretty often as our organization. I mean,
bet.
sexual addiction, betrayal trauma.
Just don't do it.
Yeah. I mean,
Man,
yeah. Or
just
pray
stop.
harder, just
Stop it,
serve
yeah.
more.
Get off the internet. Don't
Right.
do that.
Yeah. Get rid of your smartphone. It's like, well, like, I don't know. What's funny is people who say that must not remember what it was like to be a teenager and like the challenge of finding ways around all of the like hurdles we put in
Yeah.
our way. Like there was some like excitement to that. Anyways, let's not get too deep into that. But so with hot button topics like this, and I think to your point, the reason why I would even say hot button topic or controversial to your point is that there are educated people on both sides weighing in on their perspective.
Mhm.
And it's not a clear like black and white, here is the exact answer. There's a tension or a line to be walked, I
Mhm.
think. So with that, and your focus on this arena, where would you say Christians in general are missing the mark on these topics? And
Mhm.
then where are we doing a good job when it comes to these topics?
Wow. Yeah, that's a big question, and it would probably change year to year.
Mhm.
Huh.
I would say when I first really started to dive into the topic, so let's just say 8 years ago, 9 years ago, um, I think Christians were content knowing what they believe without why they believe it.
Mm.
So, um, there's a few passages Christians just kind of just absorb, like, oh yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah, therefore homosexuality is wrong. And but have they really taken time to understand some of these biblical arguments? Some are better than others. And just so everybody, I mean, to some people's chagrin, I hold firmly to a traditional view of marriage and sexuality. I think the Bible is very clear on this, and that
Mm-hmm.
even that statement makes some people upset. So
Yeah.
everything I say is under that rubric.
Yeah,
But
for sure.
yeah, there's still, I mean, hopefully I can be honest enough to say, yeah, there's still some arguments that use the Bible that aren't that good. Like Sodom and Gomorrah, there's a story about an entire city, the entire male population, young, old, um, went to go gang rape two angels who they
Yeah.
thought were men. And then I've seen Christians say, look at this passage, and they go to some 14-year-old who just said, I think I'm attracted to other boys, and like, no, it's wrong. Look, and he's looking at
Yeah.
this passage saying, I've never wrestled with wanting to gang rape spiritual beings. Like that's
Yeah.
not a thing I've wrestled
Exactly.
with,
Yeah.
and it can really, really dehumanizing. Like,
Yeah.
because Christians are looking at this and it's like, wait, are you reading the same path? Like, do you think I'm that? That's really discouraging,
Totally.
like, so I think, and this, I guess this still goes for today, like Christians in our race to defend the truth, sometimes there can be fear and kind of lack of nuance. And so I just really want Christians to think hard about why they believe what they do and develop really thoughtful reasons for what they believe that could withstand scrutiny from really smart people on the other side. And that was, I would say, the biggest hurdle for a long time in my journey was helping Christians have that kind of posture, because there's that fear, right? If I challenge some of their reasons for their belief, it sounds like I'm disagreeing with their belief. I'm like, no, I believe what your conclusion. I'm just like, let's respect the word of God enough to make sure we're handling it carefully. I think now, though, I think most churches and Christians that I work with, they've there's been so much written on it in the last 8-10 years. So they've read some books. They've got people in the congregation who are gay. They have parents who have, several gay kids now. And so it's not such an out there topic anymore. Now it's very close to so many Christians that I think there is a healthy, like, I really need to be careful with this conversation. I think another big area where Christians have kind of maybe could have done better is just understanding the complexity of language too.
Yeah.
Sometimes we conflate being trans with being gay. We do that a lot, actually, which being trans has nothing to do with being gay, really. I mean, some trans people are gay, some are straight, some are bisexual, some are asexual. Even trans can mean 11 different things to 10 different people.
Right.
Like, ask people, that person's not really trans. Well, what does it mean to be really trans? Define that for me.
Yeah. And you did that,
like,
in your book Embodied, you did that quite a bit. I mean, even on the front end, really honing in on why language matters and how all these different nuances to each term is interpreted. Because you talked about even gender dysphoria being something that people would use the word trans in order to explain that. Yeah. So language being huge for sure.
Yeah. And that's always a perpetual hurdle in this conversation, is helping people understand there's complexity with these terms. They're used very differently, and don't assume you think you know what somebody means when they use a term that maybe somebody else might use it differently, which makes discussion both frustrating and exciting,
for sure.
Yeah, I mean, for all of us to remember, we have a need to listen and to learn before we speak and judge or tell someone how to live their life. If we haven't even really understood where they're coming from, no matter how true or accurate our advice seems to us, to them it's going to land perhaps very poorly. It's like, we haven't even understood what I'm talking about or the language I'm using. And I think what I hear you saying that we do so much, and this happens for us in sexual addiction, is within our faith communities, we like to categorize people. And if we can put you in the category of, well, you're gay or lesbian or trans, and that category, then we've made all sorts of assumptions or judgments about what it means to be in that category. I think it's very convenient and clean to keep those categories so separate. And we see that with sexual addiction, which I think has kept a lot of people from healing, because it's like, well, I'm not in the category of addiction, because if I am, there's all these other things about that category that means, like, my faith is weak, and maybe I don't even really love Jesus, and I'm more in love with pleasure than I'm with God. And so that whole category, we say, well, I just struggle a little bit, right? And so
anything to abdicate myself from that category.
Right. And so rather than maybe pursuing healthy conversations around my broken sexuality, I avoid it because of the category. And I think we're seeing the same thing in the church, that we want people to be in a category, and that closes off conversation about what's really going on here, and helping people that sincerely are just maybe asking questions about what am I feeling? Where are these desires coming from? What's going on in my life? And if instead we just right away put them into a category and dismiss them, the conversation ends, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's yeah. There's a lot of parallels there for sure. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I see people in your field, not in your like in the topic you guys wrestle with, kind of conflate, periodic use, habitual addiction, like, but
Yeah.
those are kind of overlapping, but really different categories, right? If you have somebody who says, man, I'm addicted to porn. And you say, all right, tell me about that. And like, yeah, I watched it last month, once or something. Well, that's different than somebody that can't leave the house
Yeah.
without viewing porn, right? I mean, well, I'm speaking out of turn here,
Yeah.
but
No, for sure. I mean, I think that we found, and we don't want to get too ahead because I know we want to talk about this a little bit, but we found that there's a lot of motivating factors that lead people to all different forms
Hmm,
of sexual brokenness on that spectrum.
okay.
But to the point of this question, I think we really, I mean, and this is, I still think so many of us in the church grow up with black and white truth being communicated, and then when
Hmm,
we, I don't know, get outside the church doors maybe for the first time and experience life, and it's very gray, and it's like, hold on a second, this is not what I was told. This is not what I was taught. I need to make sure I
yeah.
stay black or white, black or white, and I think that it's just that struggle of, and I'm still convinced that people in the church assume that I have to be so convicted and convinced and 100% sure about what I believe in order for it to be meaningful or to have legs to stand with people who don't believe the same thing. And I think that our own doubts and insecurities oftentimes invite people in deeper to those conversations where, if we're so black and white, it can just push people away.
So
Yeah.
we get the question a lot, Preston, of, well, why doesn't Pure Desire have groups for people who are, same-sex attracted, struggling with
Hmm,
gender issues? And our common response to them is to say, we see sexual brokenness as a spectrum. And based on our story, our family of origin, our wounds and trauma, things done to us, the spectrum of sexual brokenness in our life can be pretty broad, from same-sex attraction to pornography to, the person who's having just repeated affairs.
hmm,
So I'm curious from your perspective, as you've studied and learned and listened and leaned into this area so much, to what degree
hmm.
would you say or agree that like same-sex attraction and gender issues are part of the spectrum of sexual brokenness? And where, on the other hand, might you see these topics different from
Hmm.
a Christian struggle with lust, pornography, what we might call the more typical sexual
Yeah,
brokenness?
man, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a real firm opinion on that. So I can maybe think out loud a little bit based on some experience.
Yeah, go for it.
I have had a good number of same-sex attracted Christians who are, following the traditional sexual ethic, who have said that sometimes the church can do things that come off as unintentionally othering.
Mm,
Um, like, and this would probably go to your point. Like, rather than say, "Oh, let's shuffle off all the gay and lesbian sexually broken people over here,"
Yeah.
or all the straight people go over here, it's like, well, can I just join with you in your struggles? Like, is my struggle so different that it needs a
Yeah.
whole separate category?
yeah.
So yeah, I can see a good case to be made for, a place where people are dealing with a porn addiction. Some are gay, some are bisexual, some are straight, but at the base level, there is an addiction here that they can all resonate with, and
Yeah.
obviously everybody's story is going to have a different manifestation of that. And I could see that kind of group more helpfully inclusive for sure. Are the gender thing? I would. That's the only one I'm not sure. If somebody wrestles with their gender identity, maybe they experience gender dysphoria, maybe they
Mhm.
don't resonate with gender stereotypes, there's all kinds of different variations of that. I don't know if I'd want to put them in a group where people are wrestling with sexual brokenness, because that's not technically being sexually broken. And because it could be almost be like, some people would see wrestling with gender dysphoria. It's like, what's a psychological condition? Like,
Mm.
other psychological conditions, and so
Yeah.
it's not like a sin issue they're wrestling with. They're just kind of feeling the effects of the fall. That would be one
Yeah.
form of
Mhm.
that experience, and not every, again, each person's going to be different. So I would probably hesitate putting somebody wrestling with the gender in a group of people wrestling with sexual brokenness. But I yeah, at the same time, I do know people who are same-sex attracted who do, on the flip side, find camaraderie when there are other people. It's just like, oh, you understand what I'm going through,
Yeah.
you know. And when there are in
Yeah.
other groups, they still feel like no one really gets what I go through. So I don't know. I would probably, so I would go back. I would probably lean towards being more inclusive of
Yeah.
same-sex attracted people, straight people, you know, wrestling with their sexuality.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting what you say
Mhm.
about gender. And we've said that, like, in any group, you need to feel like you at least have a level of comfort with those you're in the group with.
Yeah.
And if there's a
Right.
gender issue that you just feel like you're not even on the same page, I mean, the point of being in a group is that community that builds the trust, the camaraderie, that we're on this journey together. And
Mhm.
if being in the group itself is triggering for someone, well, that's not going to happen. And so they may
Right.
need kind of a specialized focus. But I think that's what we try to see, is that for so many of us in our places where our sexuality feels off from whatever God's design is, to be with others that are on that journey saying, I'm working through my stuff too. And maybe our stuff is different,
Yeah.
but we can have that commonality. You know, we find in groups so often that people's story, even people living, you know, straight and in a marriage, will say, I've had a same-sex story, or had something in childhood, or there's something along the way that they didn't feel safe to share, but that group context becomes a place that others hear and go, oh,
Yeah.
something like that is part of my story. And so
Right.
I think just letting people share the truth of their stories and finding that they're welcomed and accepted by people of the same gender is part of the healing, that you're not
Yeah.
off on an island all by yourself.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, yeah, that's good. Any kind of like minority atypical experience that the majority isn't going through, I think there is that kind of common bond of that very thing. I'm
Yep.
going through something that seems like most people aren't going through. So even if they're in a group with somebody else really different, but also an atypical
Yeah.
minority experience, think I could see that being helpful. I think yeah, you kind of hinted at it. I mean, it's kind of case by case basis.
Yeah.
You know, if they don't feel comfortable in this group for whatever reason, then yeah,
Right.
don't force them in it. But yeah, I think for the most part, being in some kind of inclusive group like that would
Mhm.
be I think for most people, I think most people will find that helpful.
Well, and I've seen even, I mean, Nick brings it up. Like, that's part of my story. I've never identified as gay or had same sex attraction, but I had a same sex experience when I was a kid. And I
Mm,
remember sharing that it was my first Pure Desire group. I shared it. And I
mm,
remember there was a middle aged guy in our church who had heard my story and felt comfortable to come to me and share that he had struggled with same sex attraction. And that was his arousal template, was always toward men. And it was obviously tons of shame for him, but and I didn't
right.
know it at the time, but me sharing allowed him the freedom and
Yeah.
really the safety just to be like, you know what, I really want to share this with you. And I learned, right there in that moment, that how you respond when someone shares that, and it might even be for the first time that he shared that with someone at the church. Our response matters so
Mhm.
greatly in that moment, because then that could create another wound for him if I don't respond well, or I use language that might be damaging or hurtful. So that's just been my story, and I've seen that play out in group, to what Nick is saying, that when people join a group and are comfortable enough, together in that group setting, that can unlock a lot of people, some
Yeah.
healing for sure.
Yeah,
So,
totally. Yeah, you can never predict on what story is gonna,
yeah,
give somebody else the courage to speak up. Like those are great God moments, where God shows up in just
yep,
unplanned, unpredictable ways.
yep.
So yeah, that's good.
Okay, so this is probably my favorite question, because I feel like this is the question a lot of us really wrestle with. And I know for me, I've had friends who are gay and who've been married, to the same sex, and so for me, I struggle with this one as well. But with topics like transgenderism, homosexuality, how can the church be a place of addressing these with grace and love while still, to your point, holding to the biblical ethic? So I feel like this is right in your wheelhouse, and as I was
Yeah.
flipping through your book Embodied, that idea of the logic side and the love side, like how do we maintain being in the middle where we hold both rather than leaning to one side or the other too much?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's context
Mm,
dependent. So let me give you an example. Like, I speak in a pretty broad range of churches. Some would be more progressive leaning, some more conservative leaning, some would be like very conservative. Well, if I go into I'm thinking of a church in particular in North Texas that I spoke at, Baptist church, very conservative, like very conservative. And then we come in and speak on this topic. It's
yeah.
like, well, okay, I want everybody to embody grace and truth in really radical ways. This congregation's not really struggling with the truth part. They're not asking the question.
For sure.
They're not asking the question, what does the Bible really say about marriage? They're not really wanting
Yeah.
to re-examine their theology. And me coming in, just having the conversation is nerve-wracking, you know?
Yeah.
Well, what did I do in that hour-long message I have to kind of help them to embody a Jesus posture through this whole thing? Well, I lead with 20 minutes of, pounding the pulpit with I brought a very large Bible, not really, but, like I want to give them the assurance that
Yeah.
I am not wavering on scripture. I will take a bullet for scripture. I am not, I don't be cute and kind of like, oh, you don't know where I'm going to be at for the first 45 minutes, that they're just going to shut down.
Yeah.
I lead with, here's my stance, non-negotiable, boom, boom, boom. And literally I did that. And I do this whenever I'm at a really conservative church. And the elders in the back who brought me in, they wanted me to kind of mix things up a little bit. They said they saw the tension in the room just go down. Like the shoulders even went down because like, oh, I came in ready to fight, but oh, okay, so he's safe, I think. And once I do that, then I can kind of say, okay, because we love the Bible, because we love Jesus, let's look at what the Bible says about grace and kindness and how Jesus reaches marginalized people who may be living sinful lives, Now in a more progressive environment, or I would even say a younger environment when, 20% of the room is LGBTQ. If they're not identifying, they have friends who are. This is not just an abstract thing. They have, this is a really personal thing. I kind of do the opposite. I lead with stories. I lead with telling about friends of mine who have had the church has not treated LGBT people well. Like I lead with that. And then I end up saying, okay, now with that in mind, because we love humanity so much, let's go back to the Bible, because I think God's vision for humanity is also loving. And let's look at what that vision is. So the content is almost word for word the same. It's just being sensitive to where people are coming from, and seeing what aspect of that grace truth paradigm do they need to be challenged with more, So I really have no interest in going in and preaching to the choir, I really want to check, because we're all missing it on some level. For me, I really had to grow into the grace side. For me, I mean, I'm an academic theologian. I'm very analytical. So for me, the truth part, it's easy for me to kind of the rubber band to kind of snap back in that direction, and I could fall ending and just treating it like just a theological paradigm. So I'm constantly have to challenge myself in the more grace relational side. So and everybody else, is going to have the same thing. Areas where they're like, I'm not wavering on this side of it, but this side's more of a challenge. So
Preston, can I ask on the your idea of the rubber band snapping back? What are things that you do that help challenge you to keep pushing into relationship and grace? Like, what are some things that have worked for you in that way?
So I'm an introvert, but I constantly try to stay in conversational relationship with LGBT people. I mean, just seconds before I got on with you, I spent 45 minutes talking to a friend of mine who believer transitioned 15, 16 years ago, is in a conservative Baptist church as a trans woman, very theologically conservative in many ways, and beautiful, beautiful soul. And so, she would say, like, I don't know if I could defend transitioning from scripture, but I don't think I want to go back. But I'm just really, she's wrestling with stuff, honestly, So, I talked to her for 45 minutes, and it's like, okay, this is not, I can argue on paper from my position,
Right.
But I want to listen to somebody whose story I need to hold in tension with, maybe a theological position. Hold in tension, not change my theology, but at least say, okay, there's real people on the other side of this theological argument I'm making. But if I stiff arm all the real people, then it's easy for me just to fall into this cold theological reflection and not understand the pastoral complexity on the ground, So I try, I work from home. I do a lot of writing and stuff in my basement, podcasting, but I do, speak around the country. And for me, I don't like naturally need to ever be on stage again to speak, but I do it just so I know I'm going to be in front of people. I'm going to hear stories. I'm going to have parents lining up crying because their son is now their daughter. And what do I do? So it really does force me to keep my head in the lives of real people. So
That's cool.
Yeah,
yeah.
I,
Really
I
cool.
like how you're bringing it back over and over to relationship, because I think if we assume that people, who are LGBTQ are just, headstrong in what they believe and don't want to hear anything, well, we're going to approach them a certain way. But if on the other hand, we assume they're wrestling, they're asking questions, they've got internal dialogue they're trying to figure out, and we're just trying to connect with them. It makes me think of what Tim Keller says in, I think it's Center Church, where he talks about the ABC way of teaching, that he always starts with A, like, what do we agree on? Where do we all shake our head and go, yeah, this is what we together can agree? And so, when you're with an audience that's very, younger, leaning into these topics, you want to create that sense of relational connection of like, I know people, they've been hurt, here's their stories, and now we're all kind of on the same page. And then his B is, let's look at where there's a contradiction in what you believe, and kind of naturally highlight that contradiction of belief. And then C is, take them to the beauty of God's truth. And kind of building that bridge. And I think that's what I hear you saying is, as believers, we need to come alongside and find out first, where can we connect? Where can we be on the same page? And I think this is true whether we're talking same-sex attraction, gender issues, or we're talking pornography struggles or betrayal. We're so quick to have our opinion or to think we already know what their opinion is, versus just looking to say, where can we agree and relate? And then from there, from that bridge of relational connection, let's say, okay, where's the inconsistencies, and how in a loving, gracious way could we talk about that and bring in some truthful things? So I really appreciate just that encouragement.
There's several like cognitive psychologists who even pointed out that, even in the kind of the art of persuasion, if you actually want somebody to consider your viewpoint, finding some kind of common ground is one of the best ways to kind of lower the heat, lower the temperature, lower the walls that are preventing people from even considering another position. But if you find a point of agreement, that often helps people to get into they feel, oh, okay, this person's reasonable. I feel like I can maybe listen to what they're saying. So that's and I think it just reflects the humility of Jesus too when you do that.
Well, and I feel like the people's walls that are up is because of negative experiences they've had in their past. Like oftentimes someone bashed them across the head with the Bible, which, I mean, physically that would hurt, and emotionally it hurts too. You know what I mean? Like, it's something where they're probably responding to past experiences that were damaging.
So Trevor said the last question was the big question, but I think this question is the big question that you probably get, Preston. Yeah, I think we've got the two extremes where some people would say, well, I am who I am. I can never change. This is who, and they'll even say, this is who God made me to be. So just accept me for the way I am. The other extreme might be the Christian that says, it's a sin issue. You got to repent of it, confess, and you just live differently. And I think neither of those are very helpful. So somewhere in the middle, the question lands like, can people change when it comes to sexual orientation, gender issues, or is this a struggle they will always have? How do you answer that kind of question? Because we seem to have the two polar extremes in our society.
Very carefully. Kudos
to you.
It's it is a little, and there's so much heat in this conversation that I really mean it. Like, we really do have to be careful in how we respond. It is a little bit of a loaded question. Don't you think God can change people? It's like, what do you like? Yeah. Do I think God can part bodies of water? Well, yeah. He parted the Red Sea. Does that mean every time I walk up to my pool, I just keep on walking because I'm depending on God doing this because he can't? Well, no. I mean, there's saying, don't you believe God could? Well, yeah, of course he can do anything he wants. And does this seem to be, and also, what do we mean by change? That term in this conversation is another of the many ill-defined terms. Change somebody so they will never be tempted with same-sex attraction again. Change in how they view themselves and their sexuality in relation to Jesus. Change in how they have said no to certain sexual experiences that go against God's will. Like, what kind of change are we talking about? And this isn't just semantics. These are life-changing nuances. I've seen several people literally lose their faith in God because they were told they can change. If they try hard enough, God will change them. And they interpreted that to mean no more temptation towards same-sex attraction. And because God didn't quote come through. It's like, well, obviously God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so they ditched their faith. So these are important nuances. Clarity is kindness in this conversation. So I'm on, I'm not a fan of reparative therapy, ex-gay ministries. Not that they don't bring not that they haven't done some good. I just have seen a decent amount of unintentional, for the most part, damage towards people's faith in some of these ministries. However, I also don't like the view that makes sexuality so binary, so etched in stone. I mean, there has been a lot of studies done on the fluidity of sexuality, that it is unpredictable, especially when it comes, I mean, this is not even disputed when it comes to females, that female sexuality can be very flexible and porous and fluid, and doesn't mean people flip-flop from like totally gay to totally straight, but it does mean that people who aren't attracted to the men in their life at 21 might be married to 3 kids at 32, and that's not like whoa, this is great. Like, well, no, the human sexuality is very complicated, very complicated. Lisa Diamond's a secular psychologist, a lesbian secular psychologist married to a woman. And she, it's shocking to hear, not shocking, but it's fascinating to hear her say, the whole born this way idea is a myth. It's not scientific. There's no evidence people are simply born with some innate, unchangeable sexual desire. So I think we need to honor the complexity of sex. And I know, as I'm sure you do too, a decent number of gay or same-sex attracted people married to the opposite sex. Some of whom that I know have really flourishing marriages. I know one friend of mine. I won't say they won't know him anyway, but it's just hilarious how unpredictable this conversation is. He would describe himself as very, very gay, like, married to a woman, they have kids together, but he's like, look, dude, I am still 100% attracted to men. In fact, I'm not even sure how I have 2 kids. And like 7 years into his marriage, all of a sudden he starts calling me. He says, dude, I don't know what's going on. My wife and I, we just had sex last night. It was amazing. I've never said that before. And then then they had like sex like every night that week. And he's calling me saying, I'm making fun of, we have a joking relationship. Oh, so dude, you're straight now? He's like, dude, shut up. No, I'm not at all. But like, I don't know what's going on. This is what's amazing. So, and I'm not, let me say it's loud and clear. This is not prescriptive. This is one story. All I know is you just get to know people enough, and there's just so much unpredictableness in sexuality. And I'll come full circle and say, I am not saying therefore one's general orientation towards men or women or both flip-flops back and forth. But there is some fluidity, flexibility, some unpredictable things that can happen in one's journey. So do you have any follow-up? I'm kind of dancing around maybe the question, but I'm kind of in this weird tension of the I don't want to say middle space, because again, I when I look at ex-gay ministries and reparative therapy, I'm like, that's, especially when it's forced, if somebody, I'm a big freedom guy, like if someone wants to go and try to change their sexual orientation and knows the risk benefits and everything, then hey, free country, do what you want. But where I really get nervous is when people are sold like, hey, if you do all the right things, this will happen, God will come through, and
like an equation.
That kind of mechanical.
I really appreciate your answer, because I think we get that too about, you've got to define the term change, or for us the term might be freedom. Like, people will ask, well, can you ever be free of lust, free of pornography? And I think what they mean by that word is that I will never be tempted. I will never find someone other than my spouse attractive. I'll never have those old memories resurface. Like, I will just, almost their freedom description is this robotic response to now I'm almost this asexual being. And that's our answer to people. Like, God is not going to like click off the brain that he gave you that has dopamine and neurochemicals and designed you in his goodness, designed you to find people attractive, to find beauty and connect that to sexual response. Like, in a very good and holy way, that's how God made us. And so to say freedom means I'll never again battle lust may not be a fair use of the term, but we say we believe that you can live a life where you honor God with your choices, where when you feel those triggers or temptations, you have tools and community to respond to them well. And you could really live in a way that you feel like, I'm not the person I used to be. Does lust happen? It comes up. Do I still have eyeballs and a brain? Yes.
Yep.
But I'm able to make the kind of choices that honor God. And I think in this area of our sexuality, it is important to define, like, what do I mean that I may not be able to turn off a part of my brain that's so connected to my story, to the way I was brought up, to experiences I had along the way, but I can begin to move in a direction that honors God and may involve, like you said, a story of being able to live happily in a heterosexual marriage. Those things could happen, or maybe I'm led to a place of celibacy and choosing not to be in marriage. That if we just prescribe to someone, and that's what I hear you saying, if we prescribe to someone, well, change means you'll never feel those old attractions and you will only have relationships in the way that honors God, like, I think that's a version of sanctification that we may not achieve until eternity, to be perfected into the state God designed us for. And so in this in-between time, there is a lot of gray area. And I think encouraging people to pursue God's best, to pursue God's goodness, to look at what God, how he defines health, can encourage people who may feel like, man, I don't know if I could ever cease to have these feelings or desires. Say, well, yeah, maybe you won't cease to have those feelings, but even so, might you be able to move towards the goodness of God in your life, even while feeling some of this other stuff?
Jackie Hill Perry said it best. This is a video she did for our ministry. She said, when I became a Christian, it's not that my temptations went away. It's just that I had a greater affection competing with those temptations. I thought that was a perfect way to honor the true power of God in our process of sanctification, while being honest with, our sexual desires and temptations that are always going to be there. So,
I want to mention something too, and I think it's important in the story you're sharing with you and your friend, that, for someone who maybe might not ever change those desires, those attractions, whatever, they may never change. The reality is that friend has community in you where he can be honest and he can be open and can share that. And I really do believe that living in health, maintaining, managing, whatever word that you want to use, I think that's impossible to do outside of relationship. And so that's what I think, as you tell that story, what's so beautiful is that you're able to sit in this space and be in relationship with him. And you create that environment where he can be honest about, hey, I just had sex with my wife 7 days in a row. It was amazing, but I'm still attracted to men. Like, that's a sentence that very few people will ever feel comfortable saying to any Christian ever in history, So, and I'm like talking you up a little bit, but I'm also trying to bring to the surface that there's this environment, this culture, this space where if we have relationship, that enables people to manage. I mean, I know for me in my own sexual brokenness, my addiction to pornography, sexually acting out, when I was able to be honest about those things in a community, that's what was so unlocking for me. That's where it's like, okay, I can do this, I can manage this because I'm known and I know people, they know all my stuff, and I can still be honest. And we're all on this journey of trying to continue to pursue the Lord in every area of our lives together.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And I didn't realize this, but with that, even that example, it's one thing to have a place where you can confess your sin in a non-judgmental context, but it's still going to push you towards Jesus, that sweet tension. But this was just a celebratory moment. Like even that, I hear you saying, to have community where you can even celebrate some of these really personal, obviously, and intimate wins.
Totally.
That can motivate you to keep going on.
Yeah. Okay, so another, I guess, as we get through these questions, and another big one, and another big one. So if we encounter,
there's no easy ones.
Yeah, I know. This is why we have you on, Preston, because you're the guy right now with this. So if we encounter someone who's lock solid in their belief about transgender, homosexuality, same-sex attraction, any of that, and we disagree with them on that biblical basis, what do we do in that scenario? I mean, I know even in our conversation, situation by situation, context by context, but just any perspective you might have, what do we do in that situation?
Yeah, this is, I know I've said this before, it probably applies to every question, but this one especially, it really is a case by case basis. I really want to know what's their belief God, no, God blesses same-sex marriage. That's a tip of an iceberg. And I want to know, like, what is leading to that? Was it just a raw, neutral, intellectual journey where they became utterly convinced that the Bible doesn't say that marriage is between a man and a woman? Is there a story there? Is there a personal story? Do they have a
Yeah.
friend that got kicked out of a church and that kind of scarred them? And now there's an internal motivation they might not even be able to identify to hold to that view. What is leading up to did they had an abusive father who held to a traditional view of marriage, and their whole life is patterned after not being like their father?
Mm-hmm.
So much complexity, and if you just think that it's a one size fits all reason, then you're not going to handle it well. So all that to say, I'm going to spend probably a lot of time and energy trying to understand, not just, well, I want to know why they hold to that view, like genuinely, not like interrogatively,
Right.
but like I'm curious. Like I'm really curious why you hold to this view. You obviously hold it very passionately. Like,
Mm-hmm.
would love to understand that more. And really, I don't even know what step two would be unless I understand that. If
Yeah.
if it seems like there's a lot of personal, relational reasons for holding to that view, then arguing theology it's like squirting oil on a gasoline
Yeah.
fire. Wait,
Yeah.
is that even? I don't know. You're just not.
We know what you mean.
It's
It's a
Yeah.
good
that's
illustration.
Yeah.
yeah. Like that doesn't seem to be the issue. And I have friends who it really is. Like they are intellectually convinced of these arguments. So that's what I do. Kind of, okay, let's explore these arguments.
Yeah.
Um, Oftentimes, if a person holds to that view and they talk to a Christian who doesn't, like if they talk to somebody who holds to a traditional view of marriage, typically, again, case by case, but for the most part,
Yeah.
they're going to have a pretty negative view of Christians who hold to a traditional view. So I encourage Christians, be different. Um, don't confirm their biases.
Yeah.
Be a charitable listener and a
Yeah.
loving person,
Yeah.
not because it's not a significant disagreement. It's a very significant disagreement. I don't think this is a secondary agree to disagree issue. But the only way I'm going to even get somebody else to reconsider their viewpoint that I think is very wrong is to be very kind and gracious and
Yeah.
reasonable, to show them I'm not here just to win an argument. I love you. We disagree on this. It's an
Yeah.
important thing, but your humanity means more to me.
Yeah.
Having that kind of posture is usually more conducive for getting anybody on any issue, any divisive issue, to at least be willing to engage in a charitable, reasonable dialogue about the issue at
Especially
hand.
if both people want to have that conversation. Like this is not something
Yeah.
where if you have a gay or lesbian friend, trans friend who doesn't want to talk about it, like quit bringing it up then. That's probably not going to be helpful to
Yeah.
that conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and if 2,000 years of church history and the hundreds of denominations that exist has taught us anything, when we discover real theological differences, we don't do well at resolving them. We
Nah.
tend to divide and split. And so
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you realize, like you're saying, Preston, that our difference really is, there's a theological, biblical difference. That's not to say we should part company, just go our separate ways, but I think we should take a pause to realize, okay, my arguments, my proof texting is probably not going to, that's only going to further entrench them, because if that's their theological perspective, they've considered all that and they've arrived at a different place than me. And so what would ever lead to change? Well, conversation,
Yeah.
dialogue, helpful questions, consider, have you considered this, and allowing someone to explore with you. But I just love that point again that you're saying we've got to take the time to listen to what's driving what they say and what they believe. And I love the way Andy Stanley says it in this area, that people who are nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. And so people who are nothing like the church should like the church. There should be something
Yeah.
about the way we treat people, honor people, respect their humanity, even if they are completely different than us. And right now, as we said earlier in the podcast, it feels like sadly the church,
Yeah.
in many regards, is a long ways away from that. That people who aren't
Mhm.
like the church don't think of the church as a fun place to go or a good place to hang out. It's like, whoa, why would I go there? And
Yeah.
so whatever we can do to engage in conversation, to create relationship, to
Mhm.
create dialogue, I think that's just so desperately needed in all of these areas, whether it's we're talking lust and pornography or same-sex attraction and gender issues.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's good. Yeah. It applies to all kinds of diverse and divisive
Totally.
topics,
Yep.
So, what do you say, Preston, if, and I know for a lot of our listeners, this may be the thing that's on their mind is they're, listening to the podcast because they're processing their story. They're maybe in a group, their marriage is finding traction as they're working through pornography issues. But we all have friends and family who are wrestling with same-sex attraction, saying they're gay or lesbian, transgender issues. If that person is in our life that we care about, how do we help support them? Like, what is
Mhm.
our role as a friend or a family member? What are some of the things that you encourage people? Hey, here's how to walk alongside and do life with them, and here are ways like that you'll make it a whole lot worse. What do we
Somebody
do
who
if
is somebody who's confessing Jesus, like or
I, well, I guess at this point it's either or. Like, yeah,
okay, yeah,
the person, the listener, believes in Jesus, but they've
okay,
got friends or family members that
yeah,
maybe are just wrestling with these issues, and they're just wondering what's my role in this? Should I just, like we mentioned before, just not bring it up unless they do? Should I be going after them to try to help them, see truth? What for so many people, I think the heart of this question is just when that person comes to us and says, "Hey, I'm gay,"
hmm,
or a family
right,
member says, "Hey, I've decided I'm becoming a woman," or just
yeah.
the whole spectrum of things we might hear. How should we respond, and how should we not respond?
Yeah, that's a great question, and once again, case by case. But I think there's some general principles we should be aware of. So let me start with my ultimate desire for any relationship is that would get to a place to where there could be mutual edification, where I can help the person consider and pursue Jesus and live a biblically faithful life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then if they're also desiring that for themselves, they can encourage me in that, and so on and so forth. So that's obvious, should go without saying. As a Christian, that's
Yeah.
where all of us would love to see any relationship end up. The question is, how can we cultivate the relationship with the person to even get to that point? That's where it does get complicated. So for the most part, um when somebody comes out as gay or trans, to a Christian who's not those things, there can be a lot of fear,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of assumptions, a
Mm,
lot of lack of trust. So I want to, in a sense, reverse the assumptions that they might have about me as a Christian. Um, you know, did they come out to me or tell me they're gay because they trust me, or because they kind of want to, it could be a kind of a reaction, like in your face,
Yeah.
I kind of don't
Right.
want to be around you because I heard you're a Christian, so I'm gay, deal
Right.
with it,
Yeah.
waiting for the rejection to come. And when
yeah.
it doesn't come, that could be kind of surprising. So I want to, um, okay, here's something. Actually, the conversation I just had with my trans friend who, pretty heavily involved with the trans community. And she said almost every, if not every single trans person I know in my trans community, 20, 30 trans people that she gets together with, 95% plus have had a personal, really, really bad experience with either a Christian or the church.
Mm.
Um, and so if all of a sudden you meet the trans person who has a history of a bad relational experience, we have to kind of consider that. This is an extreme analogy, okay? So don't, it's just to make a point, but it'd be like being, if you were a German missionary to Israel in 1951, and he said, "Hi, my name's Hildebred," or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
"I'm here to tell you about I'm a German," like,
Yeah.
well, it might be good to know a little bit of the history between, Germans and Jews in the Holocaust. Like,
Yeah.
you may not be that. Maybe you hate Nazis,
Right.
but you might have some deconstruction you have to do toward their assumption about who you are.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's good.
it wouldn't hurt to maybe have that in the back of your mind. Somebody comes out as gay, maybe they're a family member, maybe they're an acquaintance.
Yeah.
They might, not always, but they might have some legitimate bad experiences with Christians, not listening, not being loving,
Yeah.
being very judgmental only, truth only, no love, no grace. Maybe even, rubbing their faces in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, I don't know what it is, but maybe they probably have had. a bad experience with another Christian. So take that into consideration and focus on laying down a thick relational foundation of trust, of honesty, of being genuinely curious about who they are, emphasizing love toward the person because they might not have never heard of a Christian, really emphasizing that. So, and I say all of that because, of course I would love to get to a place to where they're like, hey, okay, so I would really love to know from you, like, what would it look like for me to really follow Jesus faithfully? But man, it's going to take a lot of foundational work to get to a place to where they're going to actually trust you enough to ask you that question.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that phrase, genuinely curious. And I think if that was just our posture, if the Christian church posture towards this whole arena could just become genuinely curious, like, I want to know, I want to hear, I want to listen. Can you tell me? Can you explain? And letting people voice their stories, letting them voice what has happened. Man, what a difference that can make. And we talk about this a lot. And maybe the similarity here to what you do, Preston, what happens with Pure Desire groups is how many times, in a group or counseling situation, someone for the first time is opening up about their addiction, their struggle, bad choices they've made. Did they have an affair? Whatever it is. And they're realizing, like, I've never told someone this, and they get it out. We talk about how important it is that the first words you speak are going to set the tone for the rest of the conversation. And those words, typically we say, should be, thank you for sharing that with me. That's amazing.
Right.
That you had the courage to trust me with that part of your story, because I bet that was pretty scary to share, because you were worried about how I would react to our group. And we just want you to know we are so grateful for you. We love you. We're thankful for you sharing that. And just the way that affirms that, okay, this is safe. We can keep having the conversation. And I think because these are areas we don't understand, many of us as Christians maybe responded to someone poorly, where we said, oh my goodness, what? Or
wow.
how long have you been lying to me? And just all the fear and the emotion comes up, and we let it come out, and it changes that whole relationship. And so I think for any listeners that maybe realize in your fear or in just your shock of having this conversation with someone, you responded poorly, that's a starting point to just go to them and say, hey, when you shared that with me, that was a pretty amazing, vulnerable moment, and I responded really poorly, and I'm sorry. I mean, that could change their perception of, maybe we could have that conversation.
Apologies do go a long way. That really, early on in my journey, I think I apologized for, I said something stupid. I was like, I'm sorry I said that. And the response they got was, I've never heard of a Christian apologizing to me before. I'm like, really?
Yeah, never. Like,
that should be
that's
cool, but
first
also
one, I guess,
super sad, right? Yeah, like, gosh, dude, Preston, I think for us, we love what you're doing. I mean, as we just had this conversation and getting to know you a little bit more, like, you just embody that person who's standing in the middle of not flexing on the Bible's sexual ethic and how God has ordained and put things in place, but then also standing in the middle, holding those relationships and pursuing that, and not leaning one way or the other, where you're sacrificing on either end. And so that's, I know for me personally, through this time together, it's been really encouraging. I know it's going to be encouraging for a lot of our listeners as well. So just, dude, thank you for what you do, and thank you for spending time with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. You too, guys. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting how much overlap and tone and perspective there is in our two ministries, which seem different, but there's obviously some overlap.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's why we wanted to have you on, because we felt like we feel some symmetry there of he's leaning into conversations the church doesn't know how to have. He's not just, you're not just providing pat answers and we'll do this and you'll be fine. Like, you're inviting people to wrestle. You're inviting people to listen. You're inviting people to lean in with love, even holding on to truth. And that's the kind of space we want to be in, is helping the church have conversations that we're just not good at having, because most of us were never taught how to have these kind of conversations. So if we're going to do this well, and I really think the church is moving into a new day where, whether it's sexual addiction, whether it's betrayal trauma, whether it's same-sex attraction issues, gender issues, like, we can't avoid these conversations anymore. And if we can help the church, and what you're doing, Preston, helping the church have these conversations well, then that gives me hope. That gives me hope that we can move in a better direction and be seen as that kind and loving place where people come to not feel like they have to run away from. So thank you for what you're doing.